Hey guy, welcome back to Sleep Among Titans, where we drift through strange and quiet corners of the past, perfect for listening before you sleep. Tonight's story is, well, it's a big one. It's about a time when the world received a very, very bad Yelp review from the universe itself. We're talking about the Black Death. And the central theme is simple, you wouldn't have made it. I wouldn't have. It's not an insult, just a statistical reality. But before the chaos, there was calm. Picture it, Messina, Sicily. October 1347. The autumn sun is golden on the water, there's a gentle smell of salt and citrus in the air. It's one of those deeply deceptively peaceful moments. Then on the horizon, 12 ships appear. Genoese trading galleys. But as they glide into the harbour, a strange silence comes with them. No sailors shouting, no celebratory bells, just the creak of wood and the whisper of wind. This silence is the real beginning of our story. It's the sound of a world about to change forever. What was on those ships, and how did people with no concept of a virus try to fight a ghost? We'll drift through the silent cities and the desperate prayers that followed. Before we drift on, let me know in the comments, what's one modern convenience you think you'd miss the most in the 14th century? It's a fun thought before things get quiet. So those quiet ships in Messina's harbour, they weren't an isolated incident. They were the endpoint of a very, very long journey. To understand how one port's bad day could ignite a continent-spanning firestorm, you first have to appreciate how cleverly the 14th century world was put together. Think of it as the original World Wide Web, except instead of fibre optics, it was woven from silk spice and the footsteps of camels. It wasn't fast, but it was incredibly vast. This was a planet connected by immense, slow-moving rivers of trade that flowed for thousands of miles. From the heart of China, the legendary Silk Road snaked its way across brutal deserts and breathtaking mountains. For months, even years, caravans would travel carrying things that seemed like magic to a European buyer, shimmering bolts of silk so fine you could pull them through a wedding ring. Porcelain so delicate it was almost translucent. And spices. The smell of a single marketplace in Constantinople could tell you stories of a dozen different lands. Cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the islands of Indonesia, nutmeg ginger, and mountains of black pepper, which was often more valuable than gold. What couldn't travel by camel travelled by sea. Maritime routes formed a liquid superhighway connecting India to the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, to Egypt, and finally across the Mediterranean. And at the centre of this web, like two rival tech giants, were the maritime republics of Venice and Genoa. They were the Google and Apple of their day, fiercely competitive, controlling the flow of information, and more importantly, immense wealth. Their ships were the physical manifestation of this globalized world. It was a brilliant system, a triumph of human ambition and cooperation. And it had one tiny fatal design flaw. There was no microscopic border control. They understood the price of saffron, but they had no concept of a bacterium. They could navigate by the stars, but were blind to the world of germs. Their universe was one of faith, and the four humours blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, a concept we'll need to understand later. They believed sickness was caused by bad air or divine punishment, not by an invisible stowaway. And right then, an exceptionally successful stowaway was making the journey of a lifetime. It travelled in the bloodstream of a black rat nestled in the gut of a flea. It hid in bales of marmot fur from the steppes of Asia. It settled into sacks of grain and bundles of cloth. This network, so perfect for transporting luxury, was about to prove it was even more efficient at transporting death. The system wasn't broken, it was working perfectly. The quiet ships were not a failure of the network. They were its most terrible success story. Now that we know how it could travel, we have to ask, what did the people of the time think it was? What was their mental toolkit for dealing with a catastrophe they couldn't possibly comprehend? Let me know in the comments before we continue if you could have one luxury good delivered to your door by the 14th century trade network. What would it be? Silk, a rare spice, maybe a handwritten book from a distant monastery. Let me know your choice. So the delivery system was in place, the package was on its way. But the story of a disaster isn't just about what happens, it's about what people believe is happening. To truly understand the sheer paralysis that gripped Europe, we need to open up the mental toolkit of the 14th century person. It's a trip into a different world. Their operating system was built on three unshakable pillars. First, God was real, personal, and directly involved in the affairs of mankind. Second, the universe was alive with mysterious forces, and the stars weren't just pretty lights. They were a roadmap to fate. And third, the human body was a strange wet container governed by a system that sounds to us like something from a fantasy novel, The Four Humours. This was the absolute peak of medical science for them. Forget germs. Disease was an internal balancing act. Your body contained 4 liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each was linked to a season and a temperament. Blood was spring, making you cheerful and energetic. Phlegm was winter, making you calm and stoic. Yellow bile was summer, fiery, ambitious, and angry. And black bile was autumn, the source of melancholy and artistic brooding. A healthy person was simply someone whose internal liquids were perfectly balanced like a well-made cocktail. Sickness was just a bad mix. Too much yellow bile might give you a fever. Too much black bile, deep depression. It was essentially the original vibes-based medicine, and every treatment from diet to bleeding was designed to restore this delicate humoral harmony. On top of this, they believed in miasma, corrupt, pestilential air. They thought disease could literally be carried on a bad smell, a foul fog drifting from swamps or unburied bodies. So this was the arsenal they had. When faced with a new terrifying illness, their first questions weren't, "What's the pathogen?" They were, "Have I sinned? Is God angry? Was there a comet? Did Mars align with Saturn, signaling doom? Is the air in my village bad? Do I have too much hot, moist blood?" Unfortunately for them, the bacterium Yersinia pestis didn't get the memo about astrology. It didn't care if you were cheerful or melancholic. It didn't respond to prayer or to bleeding. They weren't stupid, not at all. They were working with a completely different and tragically incomplete map of reality. And now the true horror was about to knock on the door. Not as a theory, not as a sermon or a star chart, but as a real physical and terrifyingly efficient predator. The stage is set. The intellectual framework is in place. Now we can finally return to those quiet ships in Messina and watch what happens when the doors are opened and the 14th century mind comes face to face with an enemy it cannot possibly comprehend. And so we arrive at the moment of ignition. Let's go back to the harbour in Messina. The 12 Genoese ships are no longer just dots on the horizon. They are here tied to the docks looming over the quay like sleeping beasts. A crowd of onlookers keeps a respectful, nervous distance. The initial excitement has curdled into suspicion. The silence is too deep, too wrong. Imagine you are there. You're standing with the city officials, the grizzled harbour master, who has seen everything, or so he thinks. A physician clutching a leather bag of herbs and instruments, his face a mask of professional curiosity, and a young priest murmuring a prayer, his eyes fixed on the silent decks. The air is warm for October, but a strange chill seems to be rolling off the hulls of these ships. There's a smell too. Not the familiar harbour smell of tar and salt and fish, but something else. Something stale and sickly, the smell of a room that has been sealed for too long. The harbour master, a man named Pietro, finally gives the order. A few brave dockhands, their faces tight with apprehension, lay a gangplank against the lead ship. Pietro the physician and the priest walk slowly up the ramp, their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silence. What they find on board isn't a scene of violence, it's a scene of profound and unsettling stillness. Men are slumped everywhere. At the oars over coils of rope beside barrels of cargo. It's as if a spell was cast, putting them to sleep mid-task. But their skin is pale, their lips have a bluish tint, and a closer look reveals they are not sleeping at all. They are gone. Then a sound, a low moan from the ship's hold. They descend into the gloom, their lanterns cutting shaky circles of light in the darkness, and here they find the few who are still alive. And it is here that the 14th century mind with its neat charts of humours and astrology shatters against a brutal new reality. The living sailors are delirious with fever, their bodies racked with shudders. They don't beg for help. They barely seem to recognise that anyone is there, and on their bodies, primarily in their necks, their armpits and their groins, are the things that will come to define the age. Strange swollen lumps the size of a hen's egg, some as large as an apple. They are hard to the touch and a dark, bruised violet-black colour. The physician, whose name is Giovanni, has never seen anything like it. This isn't an imbalance of phlegm or blood. This is something alien. An invader. He touches one of the swellings on a dying man's neck, and the man cries out with a thin, reedy sound. Giovanni recoils not just from the man's pain, but from the sheer wrongness of it all. This is a disease that wears a token, A gavocciolo, they would call it, a bubo, the calling card of the plague. In a decision born of Christian charity and profound ignorance, the city officials order the sick to be brought ashore. They are taken to hospitals and monasteries where monks and nuns begin the gentle work of tending to them. They offer them water, they clean their brows, they pray over them, and in doing so they seal their own fate and the fate of Messina. Within days the caregivers are the first of the townspeople to fall ill. A robust monk who helped carry a sailor from the ship complains of a sudden chill and a splitting headache. By evening he is burning with fever. The next morning his brothers find the telltale black swelling in his groin. He is dead by nightfall. The speed is terrifying. A healthy man at breakfast could be a memory by dinner. Panic begins a quiet, creeping thing at first. A cough in the marketplace makes people flinch away. A neighbour you've known your whole life suddenly stops answering their door. Then comes the sound of a hammer as someone boards up a house where a family has fallen sick, trapping the healthy and the dying inside together. Pity evaporates, replaced by a primal, desperate fear. Every other person is a potential carrier of this silent, swift death. Soon the church bells, which toll for every passing soul, begin to ring so constantly that they lose all meaning. They become part of the background noise of the city, a relentless reminder of the scale of the dying. The graveyards fill up, then they overflow. Normal burial rites, a coffin, a procession, a final prayer become an impossible luxury. And that's when the new sound begins. At first, it's just one cart trundling through the narrow streets in the dead of night, its wooden wheels groaning on the cobblestones. Creak, bump, creak. The sound is lonely, methodical. It's the sound of surrender. The death cart has arrived, manned by those few who are immune or simply too poor to refuse the work. The call of "bring out your dead" is still a few years away in northern Europe. Here in Messina, it's just the raw, grim work of clearing the streets before the sun rises. This sound, the slow, agonizing creak of a cart carrying away your neighbors, your friends, your family, this would become the true lullaby of a dying continent. As the carts begin their grim work, a different kind of sickness takes root: fear. The bonds of society, of family, of faith begin to fray under the strain. What happens to a city when charity becomes a death sentence? Before we follow the plague out of Messina and into the heart of Europe, consider this. It was the sight of the unknown, the bubo, that caused the most terror. Let me know in the comments what is a sound or a sight that you find deeply, instinctually unsettling, even if you can't fully explain why the spark that ignited in Messina did not stay confined to the ports. Like embers on the wind, the plague travelled inland. It moved along the trade routes, that great efficient network we talked about. It rode in the carts of merchants, in the saddlebags of travellers, in the fleas on the rats that scurried unseen. And in 1348 it arrived at the gates of the jewel of Tuscany, the proud beating heart of a New Age Florence. If you were to pick a city that represented the pinnacle of 14th century achievement, it would be Florence. It was a city of bankers who loaned money to kings of poets like Dante, who were inventing a new language of artists like Giotto, who were painting humanity with a new realism. It was a city humming with the sound of progress, the clatter of looms in the weaver's district, the chime of hammers from the goldsmiths' shops, the loud, confident chatter of commerce in the Piazza della Signoria. Florence felt invincible. It was a city that believed it was building the future. But the plague was a creature of the present, and it did not care for art or ambition. A young Florentine writer and poet named Giovanni Boccaccio watched the city's immune system fail, and he wrote down what he saw. His account, which would later frame his masterpiece The Decameron, is not just a chronicle of death, but a harrowing autopsy of a society coming apart at the seams. It began, he wrote, with the death of trust. At first it was subtle. People would step aside in the street to let others pass at a greater distance. A friendly conversation would be cut short. Then it became more overt. Neighbours who had shared meals for a generation would slam their shutters closed at the first sign of a cough from next door. The sick were walled up in their homes, a red cross painted on the door as a warning. It was a quarantine of the most brutal kind. Soon the very structures that made Florence a city began to dissolve. The city guard, the Biri, either died, fell ill, or simply deserted, leaving the streets unpoliced. The courts of law fell silent as judges and notaries vanished. Laws Boccaccio noted became meaningless because there was no one left to enforce them. A quiet, terrifying anarchy settled over the magnificent city. It wasn't loud and fiery. It was a slow, cold decay. And the soundscape of the city changed. The church bells, which had at first tolled for every death, became a maddening continuous chorus of grief. Then, as the priests and the bell ringers themselves succumbed, a new sound took over silence. One by one the bells stopped, until the city was wrapped in an eerie quiet broken only by the wind, the weeping from behind closed doors, and the relentless grinding noise of the death carts. The sound that began in Messina was now the dominant rhythm of Florence, a constant day and night reminder of the city's surrender. Boccaccio documents the final, most heartbreaking symptom of this social plague. He describes how the fear became so absolute that it severed the most sacred human bonds. Brother was forsaken by brotherly, he wrote, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited to their fate. Imagine that, the ultimate collapse. Not just the failure of law or commerce, but the failure of love itself. This was the true horror of the pestilence, not what it did to the body, but what it did to the human heart. Faced with this total collapse, the people who were left splintered into two extremes. Some, seeing no future, gave themselves over to pure hedonism. They broke into the cellars of the wealthy who had died or fled, and spent their last days in a feverish dream of feasting and drinking, believing that if death was coming, they would meet it on their own terms, and the others, the very rich who had the means, they chose flight. They packed what they could, left their magnificent city palaces, and fled to their airy villas in the Tuscan countryside. They hoped to find safety in the clean air and the isolation to wait out the miasma that they believed was choking the city. They would spend their time telling stories to pass the long quiet days, blissfully unaware of the world they had left behind. But could you really escape it? Did the plague respect the boundaries of a country estate? The story of the pestilence in the countryside is a different kind of quiet and a different kind of horror. Before we follow the wealthy into the hills, consider the choice. When society collapses, people are revealed. Let me know in the comments, in a situation with no rules and no consequences, do you believe people are more naturally inclined to be cautious and caring for the group, or to look out only for themselves? It's a question Florence had to answer, street by silent street. Of course. Here is the script for segment 5, The Countryside's Turn. This segment shifts the focus from the urban chaos of Florence to the quiet, creeping horror that unfolded in the rural villages and farms of Europe. So the wealthy of Florence fled. They retreated to their stone villas nestled in the rolling hills of Tuscany, leaving the dying city behind them. You can almost feel their sigh of relief. Here the air was clean, scented with cypress and rosemary instead of sickness. Here the only sounds were birdsong and the rustle of olive leaves in the breeze. They shut the gates, uncorked the wine, and began to tell each other stories. 100 tales of love, wit, and fortune that would become the Decameron. It was a beautiful, desperate attempt to build a fortress of fiction against a terrifying fact. The fact was, the plague did not stop at the city walls. Death did not need a formal invitation to enter the countryside. To understand the tragedy that unfolded here, you first need to understand the rhythm of rural life in the 14th century. It wasn't the bustling, chaotic rhythm of Florence. It was the slow, deep, powerful rhythm of the seasons. For the peasants, the farmers, the shepherds who made up the vast majority of Europe's population, life was a covenant with the sun and the soil. You rose at dawn, you worked the fields, you tended the livestock, you rested at dusk. The local church bell didn't just call you to prayer. It was the town clock marking the hours of a life defined by hard, repetitive, essential labour. This life was a constant struggle, yes, but it had a powerful underlying certainty. Spring meant planting, summer meant growth, autumn meant harvest, winter meant rest and repair. This cycle was as real and reliable as God in heaven. It was the machinery that kept the world turning. The plague arrived in the countryside not as a roaring fire, but as a creeping rot. It was carried by a wool merchant returning to his village by a friar, travelling between monasteries by a single rat that scurried from a grain shipment into a farmer's barn. It moved quietly from one isolated cottage to the next. In the city you saw death on the streets. Here a family could sicken and die behind their own closed door and no one would know for days. The only sign would be the silence, the smoke that no longer rose from the chimney, the dog that sat whining on the doorstep waiting for a master who would never return. And soon the great reliable machine of the seasons began to break down. The covenant was broken. The most profound evidence of the plague in the countryside wasn't in the graveyards, It was in the fields. Travellers crossing the land wrote of sights that were deeply fundamentally wrong. A plough left standing in the middle of a furrow, its metal blade rusting in the rain, as if the farmer had simply vanished mid-stride. They saw vast golden fields of wheat, heavy with grain, swaying in the wind with no one to harvest them. The bounty of the earth was being offered to no one. It was a feast for the crows and the rats. They saw livestock wandering aimlessly through the forests and fields, their newfound freedom a sign of human absence. Dairy cows, their udders painfully full, would low for someone to milk them, the sound echoing across a silent valley. Flocks of sheep, their wool thick and overgrown, scattered without a shepherd to guide them. It was the natural world suddenly cut loose from human hands, and the sight was one of profound chaos and neglect. Nature itself seemed to be grieving the absence of its caretakers. Back in their walled villas, the storytellers of the Decameron would have eventually noticed. Perhaps they would have seen the untended sheep wandering onto their pristine lawns. Perhaps they would have noticed that the little village church in the valley below, the one whose bell used to mark their days, had fallen silent. The creeping realization must have dawned on them their walls were an illusion. Their wealth had bought them a brief reprieve, not a true sanctuary. The plague was not just in the city's bad air, it was in the very soil of the land they had escaped to. In the cities there were university-trained physicians, however useless their methods were. But out here in a small village, who did you turn to? The local priest with his holy water and prayers that seemed to go unanswered. The village wise woman with her poultices of herbs and ancient folk remedies. The desperate search for a cure for any kind of explanation was about to take a different, far more dramatic turn. Because as the bodies piled up in both the grand cities and the humble villages, as the fields lay fallow and the prayers of the faithful failed, a single terrifying question began to echo across all of Christendom. Why? If God is good, why is this happening? For some, this question would lead not to quiet contemplation, but to a violent, bloody and desperate spectacle of faith. In the face of a world turning to chaos in the cities and in the countryside, a desperate populace turned their eyes to one group of men, the physicians. These weren't charlatans or village quacks for the most part. They were the highly educated elite men who had spent years at the great universities of Padua, Paris or Bologna. They read Hippocrates and Galen in the original Greek and Latin. They understood the intricate clockwork universe of the four humours. They were the scientists of their day, and they were about to walk into a biological war armed with theories that were as elegant and intricate as a cathedral, and about as useful as a paper shield against a storm of arrows. Imagine being one of these doctors. You're called to a wealthy merchant's house. You walk through streets that are unnervingly quiet, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke from sanitation fires. You carry your leather bag of tools, your mind racing through the classical texts. The patient is feverish, delirious. You see the dreaded bubo, the blackish swelling in his groin. This is the enemy's flag planted on the battlefield of the human body. So what does your 14th century medical training tell you to do? First, you must rebalance the humours. The bubo is clearly a concentration of bad, corrupt blood. The logical solution: get it out. You might take out a lancet and carefully pierce the swelling, hoping to release the pestilential fluid. Or you might apply leeches. Or you might perform phlebotomy, bleeding from a vein in the arm, believing you are draining the excess hot or moist humours that are feeding the fever. To us it sounds like torture. To them it was sound medical logic. Next, you must combat the miasma, the bad air. This was enemy number one, so you get to work on the environment. You prescribe that the patient's room be filled with the smoke of burning juniper or ashwood. You place bowls of vinegar or rosewater around the bed, and for your own protection, you hold a pomander to your nose, a small metal ball filled with powerful aromatics like ambergris cloves and mint. You are fighting a smell with another smell, an invisible fog with a fragrant shield. And then there are the prescriptions. The patient must avoid foods that are too moist, like fish or dairy. You might prescribe a potion of crushed emeralds, or perhaps the great cure-all of the aged theriac. This was a legendary, wildly complex concoction, sometimes containing over 60 ingredients, including viper's flesh opium and a laundry list of exotic herbs. The thinking was a kind of desperate shotgun approach. Surely something in this incredibly expensive and arcane mess must work. But of all their methods, one image has burned itself into our collective memory. It is the single most iconic and most misunderstood symbol of the Black Death, the Plague Doctor's costume. Let's be clear, this wasn't meant to be a horror movie costume. It was the 14th century's best attempt at a hazmat suit. Every single piece of it had a specific logical purpose. The famous bird-like mask with its long beak. That beak was a portable air filter. It was stuffed with the same aromatic herbs found in a pomander, creating a personal bubble of good air for the doctor to breathe. The glass eyepieces were thought to protect the doctor from the pestilential vapour entering through the eyes. The long waxed leather coat. It was non-porous, designed to prevent the miasma from touching the doctor's skin or clothes. And the wooden staff he carried. It allowed him to examine patients, move their clothing and direct helpers without ever making physical contact. This strange, terrifying figure was not a monster. It was a man of science cloaked in the absolute best protective technology his age could invent. And it was completely, utterly useless. The bleeding weakened the patients. The potions did nothing. And the mask, while a brilliant idea against a foe you could smell, offered no protection from the bite of a flea. Day after day, the physicians would go through these motions, applying their theories with meticulous care only to watch their patients die, one after another. The rich, the poor, the young, the old. None of them were saved. Can you imagine the psychological toll, the crushing weight of that failure? Walking home at night, the scent of cloves and mint in your mask, unable to cover the stench of death that now clung to the whole city. Hearing the creak of the death carts and knowing that the person you bled this morning is now on one of them. Your entire education, your professional authority, your belief in the wisdom of the ancients, all of it turning to ash in your mouth. You are not a healer. You are just a well-educated witness to an apocalypse. And when these men, the most learned scientists of their time, proved powerless, the people's desperation began to curdle into something else. If reason had failed, if medicine was a joke, then maybe the answer wasn't in the body at all. Maybe it was in the soul, and for some the only way to purify a soul was through pain. A shocking public and bloody spectacle of faith was about to take to the streets. So the world is ending. The pillars of your reality are crumbling. The physicians with their arcane knowledge and strange masks have failed. The priests of the Holy Church are dying in the pews beside their parishioners. The authorities have fled or fallen. Everything you believed would protect you is gone. You are left standing in the ruins of certainty, and you have a choice to make. All of humanity, when faced with an overwhelming, incomprehensible threat, splinters down two fundamental paths. The first path is flight. The second is faith. We've already seen the first path. It's the path of the wealthy Florentines, the rational if privileged response of self-preservation. It is the belief that you can outrun the apocalypse, that you can build a wall of wealth and distance between yourself and the world's problems. You retreat to your country villa, you shut the gates, you tell yourself stories and you hope the storm passes. It's an individual solution. You try to save yourself, but for hundreds of thousands of others across Europe, this was not an option. They couldn't flee, and more importantly, they believed the problem wasn't something you could run from. The problem wasn't in the air or in the rats. The problem was in the soul of mankind. The plague they believed with every fibre of their being was the righteous wrath of an angry God punishing a sinful world. And if the church was too corrupt or too weak to appease him, then the people would have to do it themselves. This belief gave rise to one of the most bizarre, terrifying and mesmerizing spectacles of the Middle Ages, the Brotherhood of the Flagellants. They appeared as if from nowhere, first in Germany, then spreading across the continent like a pilgrimage of ghosts. Imagine a procession snaking its way towards your plague-stricken town. Hundreds of men, sometimes thousands, walking in disciplined ranks. They wear white robes and hoods often marked with a simple red cross. Their heads are bowed, and they are chanting a low, guttural, hypnotic sound that seems to rise from the earth itself. They are silent except for the chanting, the shuffle of their bare feet on the road, and another sound. A rhythmic, wet, slapping sound that you can't quite place until they get closer. These are the scourges. Vicious whips, often with multiple leather tails tipped with sharp pieces of metal. When the flagellants reached a town, they would march to the main square and form a large circle. Then the ritual would begin. To the sound of their own chanting, they would prostrate themselves on the ground, rising and falling in eerie unison. Then the leader would begin to whip himself, and the others would follow suit. The rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the scourges hitting their own backs would echo off the stone buildings, a terrible hypnotic symphony of pain and penance. This wasn't random madness. It was a carefully choreographed theological performance. They believed that Christ had suffered for 33.5 years. so their processions would last for 33.5 days. Each day they would perform this ritual twice publicly, flogging themselves as a penance for their own sins and for the sins of the town they were in. They were in their minds reenacting the Passion of Christ on a mass scale, hoping that this extreme sacrifice would be enough to quench God's anger and end the plague. For the terrified, desperate citizens of a town ravaged by death, the arrival of the flagellants was a major event. They were greeted not as madmen but as living saints, holy rock stars. People would flock to watch the ritual, weeping, praying. They would dip cloths in the flagellant's blood, believing it held holy power. The tragic, ghastly irony, of course, is that these massive, unhygienic public gatherings were perfect super-spreader events. The flagellants, in their quest to end the plague through faith, almost certainly carried it with them from town to town, leaving a trail of new infections in their wake. The movement couldn't last. It was too intense, too radical. They began to claim that their rituals were so holy they could forgive sins, a power reserved exclusively for the Church's priests. They directly challenged the authority of the Pope. Their processions also in many places became a focal point for violent scapegoating and murdering Jewish communities, blaming them for the plague. Finally, the establishment had had enough. In 1349, Pope Clement VI condemned the movement, and the flagellants were suppressed, often violently, by the authorities who had once welcomed them. The procession stopped. The chanting faded. The bloody, desperate experiment in radical faith was over, having achieved nothing but more death and division. And in its place, the silence returned. But it was a new kind of silence now. Not the silence of fear and active dying, but the silence of the aftermath. The silence of a continent half empty. What does that world even look like? What happens when the fever of the plague and the fever of faith finally break? We must now drift into the quiet earth that was left behind. And then, a new kind of silence. The last frenzied chant of the flagellants has faded into the mountains. The last desperate prayer has been whispered in the dark. The last church bell has fallen still, its ringer gone. The fever of humanity, its frantic struggle against the inevitable, is finally broken. And into the space it leaves behind, the world itself begins to speak, not with a voice, but with a deep quiet and profound indifference. For the first time in centuries, you can hear the planet breathing. Let's drift for a moment, not through human drama, but through this quiet earth. Let's float above the rooftops of Paris. The grand boulevards once choked with people are now avenues of wind. A fine green dust of moss begins to soften the sharp edges of the cobblestones. In the silent courtyard of the Louvre, now a grim and empty fortress, a wild fox makes its den. Birds no longer scared away by the noise build their nests in the mouths of the gargoyles of Notre Dame, their cheerful chirps an alien sound in the solemn quiet. The wind whistles a low, mournful tune through the shattered stained-glass window of a lesser chapel, a song only the stone saints can hear. Let's drift south to the canals of Venice. The water, for a brief miraculous moment, runs clear. With the constant traffic of gondolas and barges gone, the sediment settles. You can see the green stones of the canal floor, the small fish darting in the sun. The ornate marble palaces stare at their own reflections in the still water, their intricate facades mirrored perfectly, no ripples to disturb the image. It is a city of impossible beauty, now a perfect silent museum of itself. Now let's leave the cities entirely and sweep over the countryside of England or France. The carefully drawn lines of feudal life, the hedges and stone walls that separated one lord's land from another's, begin to blur. Hawthorn and briar roses grow wild, stitching the landscape back together into a single untamed tapestry. The abandoned cottages of the peasants sag and sigh. Thatch roofs no longer maintained become fertile ground for weeds and wildflowers. A door left ajar 5 years ago creaks on its rusty hinges, opening and closing with the wind, a lonely conversation with an empty house. And the animals. The old order is broken. Sheep no longer belonging to any master wander in straggling independent flocks. Herds of deer, grown bold, step cautiously into the empty squares of abandoned villages, grazing on the herbs left in a forgotten kitchen garden. In the deep forests of Germany, the wolves return. Their distant howls are heard in places that haven't heard them for 300 years. They are not a threat. They are simply a sign that an older, wilder world is patiently reclaiming its territory. The sun does not know what has happened. It rises each morning, casting its golden light on fields of wheat that have seeded themselves, grown and fallen, all without a human hand to guide them. The rain does not know. It falls with gentle impartiality on the roof of a king's empty castle, and on the skeletal remains of a peasant's ox still yoked to its plough. The seasons turn unaware that the species that marked them so carefully is now hiding diminished in the ruins. Nature is not healing. Nature is not angry. Nature is simply continuing. Its rhythms are deeper and slower than our own. The plague, for all its human terror, was just a brief, violent spasm in the long, slow life of the earth, a fever that came and went. But the silence cannot last forever, because humanity, for all its fragility, is also persistent. Into this quiet, rewilded, and indifferent world the survivors are about to emerge. They will step out from their shuttered homes, blinking in the strange sunlight of a planet that no longer seems to have been made for them. Who are these people, the ones who lived, and what will they do now that they have inherited a world that is at once their home and a terrifyingly empty wilderness? The story of the Black Death is over. The story of its survivors is about to begin. Into the quiet earth the survivors emerge. They unbar their doors not with a sense of triumph, but with a weary, hesitant caution. They step out into the sunlight, and the world they find is both perfectly familiar and terrifyingly alien. The buildings are the same, the streets are the same, but the human music is gone. The air once thick with the sounds of life of children playing merchants, haggling neighbours arguing is now shockingly thin. The only sounds are the wind, the unnervingly loud chirping of birds, and the sound of their own footsteps, which seem to echo with a profound loneliness. These are the inheritors of the quiet earth, and it's important to understand who they were. They were not the strongest or the bravest or the most pious. They were simply the lucky ones, or perhaps the cursed ones, depending on the day. They were not conquerors of the plague. They were its leftovers, and they now had to figure out how to live in a world that felt like a museum of their own recent past. The first and most overwhelming feeling was grief. A grief so vast and all-encompassing it had no name. A chronicler in Siena Agnolo di Tura, who survived the plague after burying all 5 of his children with his own hands, wrote simply, "And he Agnolo di Tura, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so many died that all believed that it was the end of the world." That was the psychological ground zero. The belief that you were living after the end of time. Every survivor was a ghost haunted by the ghosts of everyone they had ever known. A farmer would walk into his barn and see the tools of his dead sons untouched from the day they fell ill. A woman would walk down her street and know the names of the families in every silent house. A priest would stand before his congregation and see a sea of empty pews, each one a testament to a soul he had failed to save. And coiled within that grief was the toxic question: why me? Why did I live when my wife, my child, my brother did not? There was no answer. The plague had been terrifyingly arbitrary. It took the devout and the sinner, the strong and the weak, the rich and the poor, with no discernible logic. This randomness shattered the medieval certainty of a just and orderly universe. If your piety couldn't save you, what was its worth? If the good died just as horribly as the bad, what did it mean to be good? The survivors were left with a deep spiritual vertigo, a sense that the very rules of reality had been broken. But alongside the grief and the trauma, another stranger feeling began to surface. A feeling that was almost shameful to admit. It was a sense of profound, terrifying freedom. Think about it. The rigid, suffocating social structure of the 14th century was built on a surplus of people. Everyone had a place, and almost no one could leave it. You were a peasant, and you would die a peasant bound to your lord's land. You were an apprentice facing years of servitude. You were in debt to a moneylender. You were the third son with no hope of inheriting the family farm. And then suddenly, everyone was gone. The lord of the manor is dead. The master craftsman is dead. The moneylender is dead. Your older brothers are dead. It was the grimmest lottery in human history, and the survivors had by default won. A man who expected to spend his life toiling on a tiny plot of land might suddenly find himself the sole heir to a vast fertile farm. A woman might inherit 3 houses on her street filled with the furniture, clothes and ghosts of her former neighbours. Debts were wiped clean because the ledgers and the lenders were gone. This new reality was dizzying. For the first time there was more land than there were people to work it. There were more homes than families to live in them. More tools than hands to wield them. The survivors were a generation that had lost everything and in doing so had inherited the earth. This combination of deep trauma and radical new freedom forged a new kind of person. A person who was more cynical, having seen the failure of all authority. More individualistic, having learned that in the end you were on your own. More pragmatic and perhaps a little harder of heart. They had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had in a sense blinked first. This new inheritance of a half-empty world wasn't just a personal windfall, it was an economic earthquake, and its aftershocks would bring the entire feudal system crashing down. For the first time in centuries, the humble peasant in the field held a strange and powerful new weapon, his own scarcity. The survivors inherited the earth, but it was an earth whose operating manual had been thrown into the fire. The old feudal system, a rigid pyramid that had structured European life for centuries, was built on one simple, brutal fact: a massive surplus of cheap human labour. The lords had the land, and the vast teeming peasantry worked it for scraps, their lives bound by duty, obligation, and the lack of any other choice. The machine was designed to keep the many poor and the few rich. The Black Death did not just damage this machine, it fundamentally broke it by removing its primary fuel source, people. Overnight, the most basic law of economic supply and demand asserted itself with a vengeance. Suddenly, healthy, able-bodied workers were not a cheap, endless resource. They were a rare and precious commodity. And for the first time in memory, they knew it. Let's imagine a scene. It's a year or two after the plague has passed. A lord, let's call him Sir Robert, surveys his land. His family survived, but most of his peasants did not. His fields are overgrown with weeds, his harvests are rotting, his sheep have wandered off. He's land-rich and labour-poor. He needs his fields ploughed. He summons one of the few surviving peasants, a man named Will. Before the plague, this conversation would have been an order. Now it's a negotiation. Sir Robert, trying to maintain his authority, tells Will it's his duty to work the land. Will, who is now the sole heir to his father's and two uncles' plots of land, has more work than he can handle himself. He looks at the lord, his eyes no longer downcast, and says no. Or rather, he says, no, not for the old wages. He wants double, and he wants to be paid in coin, not in grain, and he no longer wants to work the traditional 3 days a week for free on the lord's personal land. Sir Robert is stunned. This is not just insubordination, it's a violation of the natural order of the world. But what can he do if he refuses? Will can simply walk down the road to the next manor where another desperate lord will likely meet his price, or offer him even more. For the first time, Will has leverage. He has freedom of movement. He has options. This quiet, tense conversation happening in muddy fields all across Europe was a revolution. Not a revolution of swords and banners, but one of hard, practical economic reality. The ruling class, of course, was horrified. They saw this not as a logical market correction, but as a moral failing. The peasants were getting greedy, lazy, uppity. Their response was to try to outlaw reality itself. In 1351, the English crown passed the Statute of Labourers. It was a piece of legislation born of pure panic. It made it illegal for employers to pay more than pre-plague wages and illegal for workers to demand them. It forbade peasants from leaving their master's land in search of a better deal. It was in effect a law against the tide coming in. And it was a spectacular failure. You can't legislate away your own desperation. The lords themselves would break the law, secretly offering higher wages to lure workers from neighbouring estates. The statute was unenforceable, and it did little more than breed a deep, simmering resentment among a working class that had just tasted real power for the first time. That resentment, bottled up by laws designed to put them back in their place, had to go somewhere. The quiet defiance in the fields began to curdle into organised violent anger. A generation after the plague, this tension exploded. In 1381, England erupted in the peasants' revolt. Tens of thousands of commoners, led by figures like Wat Tyler, marched on London, burning the homes of nobles and demanding an end to serfdom. Their slogan, preached by radical priests, was a question that struck at the very heart of the feudal system, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. In other words, in the original uncorrupted world of Adam and Eve, there were no lords or nobles. All were equal. This idea that social hierarchy was not a divine law, but a man-made invention, was perhaps the most powerful and enduring contagion the plague left in its wake. This newfound sense of individual worth didn't just play out in wage negotiations and open revolt. It began to seep into the culture, into the very art that the survivors created. The old stiff religious art of the past started to make way for a new, morbid obsession with the one thing that had truly united the lord and the peasant: the great equalizer itself. How does a society process a trauma that has no precedent, when the prayers have faded and the revolts have been crushed, when the world settles into its new emptier shape? How do people make sense of what they've lived through? They do what humans have always done. They make art. Before the plague, medieval art was a fairly confident affair. It reflected a world of order, hierarchy, and divine certainty. You had serene paintings of the Madonna and child stoic, idealized portraits of kings and saints and beautiful stained glass windows telling biblical stories where good triumphed and the universe made sense. It was art as a perfect polished mirror reflecting a divinely ordained reality. The Black Death took that mirror and shattered it into a million pieces. The art that came after is the art of a civilization picking through the shards, trying to find its own reflection in the fractured, distorted surfaces. And the image they saw staring back was more often than not a grinning skull. The survivors became obsessed with death, not in a quiet philosophical way, but in a vivid, urgent, and deeply morbid fashion. And this obsession produced one of the most powerful and enduring artistic motifs of all time, the danse macabre, the dance of death. Imagine you're a peasant in the late 14th century. You walk into your local church, and there on a newly painted fresco is a sight that is both terrifying and strangely satisfying. A long dancing procession snakes its way across the wall, but this is no ordinary dance. It is a conga line of the living and the dead. Look closer. Here is the Pope, his face a mask of horror, his triple crown askew. A jaunty animated skeleton is tugging at his holy robes, leading him into the dance. Next comes the Emperor, his robes of ermine no defense against the bony hand grabbing his own. Here is the wealthy merchant clutching his money bags, but the skeleton beside him is already counting the coins. Here is the beautiful vain maiden, her long hair flowing, recoiling, as a skeletal figure offers her a mocking bow. And here at the end of the line is a simple farmer, much like yourself, looking just as terrified as the Pope as his own skeletal twin takes him by the hand. This was the danse macabre. It appeared everywhere in church paintings, in woodcut prints, in the margins of prayer books. On one level, it was a classic Christian reminder of memento mori, remember you must die. It was a call to piety, a warning not to get too attached to the fleeting glories of the world. But the Black Death gave this old theme a new revolutionary and deeply satirical twist. The real message of the danse macabre wasn't just that you will die, it was that everyone will die, and in exactly the same way. Death was the great equalizer. The skeleton leading the king was no more respectful than the one leading the peasant. Its bony grin was the same for the bishop and the beggar. In the democracy of the grave, all were commoners. This was the artistic echo of the peasant's defiant cry. Who was then the gentleman? The answer painted in grim detail on the church wall was a resounding nobody. For the common person who had survived the plague, who had seen the rich die as horribly as the poor, and who was now demanding a new respect for their own life and labour, this art was a profound validation. It was a promise that the arrogant lord and the corrupt bishop who still tried to rule their lives would in the end face the same ignominious twitching dance. For the first time, the common man had an ally who was guaranteed to win every argument a skeleton with a lute. This morbid obsession didn't stop there. Another popular motif was the three living and the three dead, where three handsome young nobles out hunting would stumble upon three decaying corpses, their own future selves, who would warn them, "As you are, we once were, as we are, you will be." Tombstones changed too. Instead of carving an idealized peaceful effigy of the deceased, the new fashion of transy tombs depicted the person's rotting corpse complete with worms and decaying flesh, a brutal reminder of the body's futility. This art wasn't just a society indulging in horror, it was a society trying to tame its trauma. By giving death a face, a personality, a sense of humour, they were trying to make it less terrifying. They were grappling with the randomness and the horror they had witnessed by turning it into a story, a dance, a shared public nightmare. But this profound questioning of earthly power in the fields, on the streets, and on the walls of churches was being echoed in the quietest corners of Europe. While artists were busy painting skeletons, scholars in the new universities, and monks in their quiet cloisters were starting to dissect the body of knowledge itself. The old answers from God and the ancient Greeks had failed. It was time to start asking new questions. For 1,000 years, the Catholic Church had been the great stone cathedral at the centre of European life. It was more than just a place of worship. It was the sole provider of truth, the ultimate authority on morality, the guarantor of social order and the exclusive gatekeeper to eternal salvation. Its foundations were thought to be unshakable, its walls protected by God himself. The Black Death was the earthquake that no one saw coming. It didn't topple the cathedral, not overnight, but it sent deep spiderwebbing cracks through its very foundations, and in those cracks something new and unexpected began to grow. The church's authority was damaged not by an outside enemy, but by its own profound powerlessness. First, there was the practical failure. The prayers, the holy water, the sacred relics, the processions, none of it worked. God, it seemed, was not listening. Priests who were on the front lines, comforting the sick and administering last rites, died at a horrifying rate often higher than that of the general population. This was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was an act of incredible bravery and faith. On the other, it was a terrifying demonstration that holiness offered no protection. Then came the institutional failure. To fill the tens of thousands of empty parishes and monasteries, the church had to lower its standards and fast. Men who were poorly educated, who lacked a true calling, or who were simply opportunistic, were rushed into the priesthood. The general populace saw this. They saw priests who couldn't properly read the Latin Mass, or whose morality was questionable. This led to a catastrophic loss of prestige. It was a spiritual dilution, and the people could taste the difference. But the deepest crack was theological. The church had no good answer. The why was deafening. If the plague was a punishment for sin, why did it kill innocent babies in their cradles? Why did it strike down pious monks and selfless nuns while some corrupt officials and greedy merchants survived? The old simple answer, "It is God's mysterious will," began to sound hollow to a generation that had been so intimately acquainted with meaningless suffering. And to make matters worse, just when the world needed a unified, compassionate and steadfast spiritual leader, the papacy was in the midst of a political meltdown. The Pope was living in Avignon, France, seen as a puppet of the French king. Soon after the plague, the church would shatter completely in the Great Western Schism, with 2 and eventually 3 rival popes, all claiming to be the one true vicar of Christ and excommunicating each other. It was a messy, deeply unholy and very public divorce. It revealed to everyone that the church was not just a divine institution, but a very human, very flawed and very political one. Faced with an institution that could not protect their bodies or satisfy their minds, people began a slow, quiet turn inward. If the grand universal church had failed, perhaps faith had to become more personal. And if the old answers were no longer sufficient, perhaps it was time to ask new questions. In the quiet libraries of monasteries and the new bustling universities, scholars began to look for wisdom beyond the approved texts of the church. They started rediscovering the lost and neglected works of the pre-Christian world, the philosophy of Plato, the rhetoric of Cicero, the poetry of Virgil, and they found something astounding that one could find: wisdom, virtue, and a guide to living a good life without any reference to the Christian God. This was the birth of humanism. It wasn't a rejection of God, not yet, but it was a radical shift in focus. It was the belief that humanity itself was a worthy subject of study, that life on earth was not just a miserable prequel to the afterlife, but something of immense value, full of potential for greatness, for beauty, for knowledge. The central question began to shift from, how do I save my soul for the next world, to what is the best way to live a full and meaningful life in this one? This intellectual shift was the seed from which the Renaissance would bloom, the explosion of art that celebrated the human form, the scientific inquiry that dared to question the heavens, the political philosophy that reimagined the state. All of it was fertilized by the doubt and the quiet questioning that grew in the plague's wake. This new, confident questioning spirit would eventually lead a century and a half later to the Protestant Reformation, the ultimate challenge to the Church's authority. The plague didn't cause these movements, but it created the cracked foundations in which they could take root. The world had been remade, its economy, its art, its social structures, and now its very way of thinking about God and itself, all had been transformed by the crucible of the plague. But the memory of the pestilence itself didn't just vanish into the history books. It lingered as a scar on the collective soul, a ghost that would reappear in waves for centuries, a final quiet reminder of how fragile everything truly is. It would be comforting to think that the story ends there, that in 1351 the survivors stepped out into the quiet world, rolled up their sleeves and began the slow, steady work of building the Renaissance. It would be comforting, but it wouldn't be true. The Black Death was not a single discrete event. It was not a storm that came and went. It was a ghost that decided to take up permanent residence in Europe. For the next 300 to 400 years, the plague would return. It came back in 1361 in an outbreak they called the pestis puerorum, the plague of children, because it disproportionately took the young who had no immunity. It came back in the 1370s. It came back again and again in great terrifying waves and in smaller localized ripples. London, Venice, Moscow, Marseille, every major city and countless small towns would have their own Great Plague story, their own year of the death carts and the silent streets well into the 17th and even 18th centuries. The trauma became a permanent part of the European psyche. It was a phantom limb. The continent had lost nearly half of its body, and the ache of that loss, the fear it could happen again, never truly went away. But something had changed. The first great wave had shattered their certainty and their old ways of thinking. The subsequent waves forced them to become pragmatic. If prayer and piety couldn't stop it, then maybe something else could. Out of the recurring terror, the first seeds of a revolutionary new idea began to grow public health. The Italian city-states whose economies were constantly being wrecked by these outbreaks led the way. The Republic of Ragusa on the Dalmatian coast was one of the first. In 1377, they decreed that any ship arriving from a plague-affected area had to anchor at a remote island and wait for 30 days at Trentino before anyone could come ashore. The Venetians' masters of trade and bureaucracy refined this idea. They extended the waiting period to 40 days a 40 giorni. From this, we get our modern word quarantine. They built the world's first dedicated quarantine stations, the lazaretti, vast isolated complexes where entire crews and their cargo would be housed. They invented the health pass, a signed document certifying that a traveller came from a city free of plague, an ancestor of the modern passport. They would create the cordon sanitaire using armed guards to completely seal off a town or region, letting no one in or out. This was a monumental shift. It was the state for the first time taking organised secular and often brutal action to control the spread of disease. It was an admission that this was a physical problem that required a physical, not just a spiritual solution. The memory of the plague forced a new kind of civic discipline into being. But the deeper scars were not in the law books, they were in the culture. The fear was passed down through generations. It's said that the children's nursery rhyme Ring Around the Rosie is a folk memory of the plague. A pocket full of posies refers to the herbs people carried to ward off the miasma. Ashes, ashes, or in another version, a tissue, mimics the sound of a sneeze, one of the later symptoms of the pneumonic plague. And the ending is, of course, we all fall down. Historians debate the rhyme's true origin, but it doesn't really matter. The fact that we so easily believe it to be about the plague shows how deeply its narrative is woven into our consciousness. It became the ultimate bedtime story, a way to tame the terror and make it familiar. And that is how history is truly remembered. Not in the grand chronicles of popes and kings, but in the small, quiet echoes passed from one generation to the next. Let's end our journey with one last story. Imagine it is 100 years after the first great wave. A grandmother sits by the fire with her young grandchild. The child, living in a world still shaped by the pestilence, asks, "Grandmother, what was it like in the time of the great dying?" The old woman is silent for a long time. She doesn't talk about the flagellants or the art or the popes in Avignon. She points to the empty chair in the corner of the room. "That chair," she says, "belonged to my uncle. He was a stonemason." She gestures down the lane. "You see the baker's shop, the one that has been empty for 50 years. A man named Thomas lived there. He had 2 daughters with hair the colour of honey." She looks into the fire, her eyes seeing a different room, a different time. "When I was a little girl," she says softly, "at dinner every single chair at our table was full. That is the final accounting of the Black Death. Not the tens of millions of dead, a number too vast to comprehend. But the quiet, profound and permanent emptiness of a single chair. The story of history is not the grand narrative. It is the collection of all these silent empty spaces. And now, as we leave this long and shadowed past behind, it is time to turn our thoughts toward our own quiet space and the peace of the present moment. And so our long walk through the 14th century comes to an end. We have drifted through its strange and quiet corners, from the sun-drenched peace of a Sicilian harbour to the profound silence of a world reborn. We have stood beside the helpless physician, watched the eerie procession of the flagellants, and felt the quiet satisfaction of the peasant who finally learned his own worth. We saw a world crack and we watched as a new one scarred and changed began to push its way through the ruins. The story is over, but the echoes remain. The creak of the death cart's wheel is no longer a sound of dread, but a distant echo, a reminder of a fear we no longer have to feel. The frantic tolling of the church bell is now silent, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of your own breathing. The empty chair from the grandmother's story has been put away. The past is now where it belongs in the great quiet library of memory, a story that has been told. Their struggles, their questions, their desperate search for answers in a world that had none. That was not all for nothing. The societies they built from the ashes of the old world became the foundation of our own. Their fumbling, desperate invention of quarantine was the birth of our modern public health. Their defiant demand for individual worth was the whisper that grew into our ideas of liberty and human rights. Their questioning of old, failed authorities planted the seeds of our own scientific and intellectual traditions. We live in a world that was shaped by their loss and built by their resilience. And now it is time to leave their world behind completely and to become aware of your own. Think of where you are, not in a drafty wattle and daub cottage listening for the sounds of sickness in the night. You are here, in a safe room, in a comfortable bed. They fell asleep terrified of the miasma, the bad night air that they believed carried death. You can take a deep, slow, clean breath and feel nothing but calm. They fell asleep to the sounds of weeping or the rumble of the death cart. Your night is filled with a gentle, predictable silence, perhaps the quiet hum of electricity or the sound of distant, peaceful traffic. Their world was one of profound uncertainty. They did not know if they or their children would see the sunrise. Your world right here, right now, in this moment is one of profound safety. Feel the simple, solid reality of it. The weight of the blankets on you, the softness of the pillow beneath your head, the solid floor beneath you, and the sturdy roof above. These are luxuries they could not have imagined, comforts bought by centuries of struggle. Their greatest hope was to simply survive the night. Your greatest task right now is to let go of the day, to give yourself over to the gentle restorative darkness. Their story, for all its horror, was a story of life's fierce, stubborn desire to continue. And sleep is a part of that too. It is the quiet, nightly work of mending, of restoring, of preparing for a new day, that you know with a certainty they never could will come. Let the figures from our story fade. Let the doctor hang up his beaked mask. Let the peasant lay down his tools. Let the king and the pope and the merchant and the maiden finish their long, macabre dance. Their parts are played, their struggles are over, and so is yours for tonight. The narrative is finished. The history is complete. There is nothing left to do now but rest. Allow your thoughts to slow down. Let the images of the past dissolve like mist. Your only focus now is the simple, easy rhythm of your breath, in and out. Feel the last of your own worries and anxieties detach and drift away. They are not for now. Now is for peace. Now is for quiet. Now is for sleep. Their story is told. Rest now. Sleep now.